back to Grandpa Geek.
So Kenzie, you have a question for me today.
Yes, I was wondering how different rocks were formed.
Well, I know that you have a rock collection, and so do I. We both really like rocks, and rocks are interesting. And that's a good question. How are rocks formed? Actually, the kind of rocks, there are different kinds of rocks that are classified based on the way that they're formed. But before I talk about rocks, I should probably clarify some vocabulary, because we use some of these terms pretty often, but we're not necessarily very careful about it. Because technically, there are minerals, there are gems, and there are rocks, and they're actually different. So, a mineral is a solid, an inorganic solid that occurs naturally, but it's homogeneous. What that means is that it's all made up of the same thing, right? It's not a mixture of things. So it's chemically, all of it is made up of the same composition. That's what a mineral is. Now, some minerals are very ornamental, right? They're very pretty. And there are about 20 that are called gemstones. And what a gem is simply a mineral. So again, it's homogeneous, it's pure, but it's ornamental. And gems really have three things in common. So they are beautiful, they're durable, and they're relatively rare. And that's what makes them into a gem. And so, you know about gems. I mean, those are the precious things that everybody wants, like diamond rings and rubies and all that. So you have minerals, which are pure. You have gems, which are ornamental minerals. And then you have rocks. And what a rock is an aggregation of minerals. Do you know what aggregation means? It means combination. When you put some things together. And so it's quite common with rocks that you'll have something called a substrate. And that substrate is the kind of the main part of the rock. And then it'll have some gems or some minerals that have mineralized or solidified in that rock into little crevices or little pockets. And so that's the way like an agate forms. It forms, it mineralizes inside of a substrate. And then when it washes up on the beach, it's all been ground up, and so that only the little pocket was left. So we talked about minerals, we talked about gems, and we talked about rocks, right? But let's get back to your question, how do rocks get formed? Well, the first category of rocks is igneous. And these are really igneous minerals, but we'll just generalize. Igneous rocks are rocks that are formed from molten rock or melted rock, right? So below the crust of the earth, it's very, very hot, and the rock is all fluid and melted in it. It's hundreds and hundreds of degrees hot, right? So if it can find a path up to get out of the core of the earth and gets up into the crust, if it solidifies before it gets all the way to the surface, I got to make sure I get this right. I've got some notes here. Yeah, it's called an intrusive igneous rock. So that means that it cooled before it got to the surface. It's an intrusive igneous rock. If it comes to the surface and then cools, it's called an extrusive igneous rock. So a good example of that is lava. You see in a volcano, you see the lava flowing, and that lava is an extrusive igneous rock. So when it cools, it becomes hard and it becomes a igneous rock, right? So igneous rocks are important because about 95% of the Earth's crust is made up of igneous rocks. Most of it, in other words, right? However, a lot of it is hidden below a very thin layer of sedimentary rocks. And we'll talk about sedimentary in a minute. But before we talk about that, the next category of rocks is called metamorphic rocks. You know what the word metamorphosis means? Do you know what it means? You do know what it means. it means to change, right? So a metamorphic rock is a rock that has changed its physical properties because of exposure to pressure or temperature or a combination of those things. And so a metamorphic rock is, maybe like the concept of a diamond which is nothing more than a piece of carbon that's been under intense pressure and heat, which then causes it to form and crystallize into a diamond, right? So you have the igneous rocks, which are the most common, and some examples. I wrote down some examples. So igneous rocks, obsidian, which is a pretty hard rock and really cool looking stuff. It's kind of colored, glassy looking. Pumice, which is a super soft rock. It's one of the softest rocks on the rock hardness scale. And then basalt, which is one of the most common rocks. So you've heard of Beacon Rock in the Columbia River Gorge. Beacon Rock is one of the largest monoliths, in other words, a single huge rock in the world. And it's made of basalt. So there's a lot of basalt around us on the Pacific coast and the Columbia River Gorge. And granite. Granite is another kind of igneous rock. Sedimentary rocks, talk about in a minute. Metamorphic rocks I talked about would be things like gneiss, marble, schist, and slate. And so what's interesting is you see a lot of those kinds of rocks in the United Kingdom. When we were in Scotland, we saw lots of gneiss, which is formed there. Very, very ancient rock. In Wales, they use a lot of slate because it's very common there. So very common to see those rocks in Western Europe. Then the last kind is sedimentary rock. And sedimentary rock is really, it's made up of eroded or decomposed igneous and metamorphic rocks. So when you take a rock and you grind it all up into little bitty particles and it washes down a stream or down the hillside, and it creates layers and layers and layers of these tiny particles. And then those particles eventually, because of they get so deep, they're under a lot of pressure, they cement together, and that creates a sedimentary rock. And you can tell sedimentary rocks a lot of times because they have like layers. You can see distinctive layers, like they're made up of, like stacking a whole bunch of pieces of paper together. And examples of those are chalk, limestone, sandstone, and shale. Okay? So those are the main kinds of rocks, and that's the main way that rocks are formed. Did I answer your question? Make sense?
Yeah.
Well, please leave comments, join in the conversation, contribute your ideas to how to explain this better. By all means, augment the things we've talked about with what you've learned about rocks and the way that rocks are formed. And come back and join us again in the future for another question from Kyler or Kenzie. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.